It's a noisy morning here at the Skunk Works. We've got guys working outside there, so try to ignore the outside sounds. We don't have a sound studio. We got this. So working on Plane Z, we're moving along, you know, making progress at a glacier's pace, but we're still making progress. The other night, I stripped the headers, gave them a coat of paint, cured them with a torch. They should look good for 6 or 7 minutes after we start the engine, so that's good to go. And working on the motor. So we finished all of our cleaning and prep on the block, gave it its final hone, dropped the crank in, all is well. And I was just getting ready to start dropping pistons and rods in. And I said to myself, wait a minute, this is a great time to do a helpful tips video for the home rebuilder. Because what I'm doing here is exactly what you would be doing, let's say, at your house. And I'm using the same tools and the same procedures you would use at your house. So if you're just learning this stuff, here's some stuff I know you can use this. So, like I said, we're getting ready to do pistons and rods. Now, this engine isn't being built from a single core. It's being built from parts that are laying around. So I didn't have a full set of pistons. What I did was I rounded up a bunch of, you know, cores. I've got these things laying all over the place. And I dropped off a set of 6 and then 1 extra at the machine shop. And as it turned to be cleaned up. And as it turns out, I should have sent more than that, because out of the 7 that I sent, 5 came back and they're good to go, but I found issues with 2 of them. So based on what I found here, that's what we want to talk about. So like I said, 5 of the 7 I sent were good. 2 of them came back with issues. So the first thing I want to talk about is connecting rods. Right? Now, obviously, you've got your motor broken down. And, you know, it's important to say this here. The vast majority of home rebuilds aren't really rebuilds. They're freshen-ups. So like a rebuild would consist of, let's say, boring the engine, throwing fresh pistons in it, all new stuff, right? Most of the time, you're doing this at your house, you're doing this on your own ride, you're just doing a freshen-up. So you're going to break the motor down, clean everything, hone it, rings, bearings, gaskets, oil pump, slam it back together again, call it good to go. Now, in our case here, we're using stock pistons, stock rods, and the block is still at standard bore. When we checked the block, it had no bore taper. The engine that we're building here is never going to see, this particular one isn't going to see any boost, it's not going to see any nitrous, it's not going to see anything over, let's say, 6,000 RPM, because the head just is not going to allow that. So, and with the material we've taken off the block and off the head, our compression ratio ends up right at about 10 3/4 to 1, which is with the stock piston. So there's no reason for us to use anything other than the stock replacement pistons on these. That said, after you've cleaned everything up, and cleanliness is really important here because you've got to inspect, you've got to be able to see every piece of this. You want to look things over. So what we found here, one of the things you want to check is the straightness of the rod, connecting rod. Now, unfortunately, the way a rod is constructed, there's no place where you can really lay a straight edge over the thing to see, you know, if it's out. You've kind of got to rely on eye, you know, and when they're bent, you know, you can actually see it, but they only have to be out a couple of thousandths of an inch to make a difference. On this one here, we found a scuff mark on the side of the piston, right there. Okay? Now, what that scuff mark is telling us is that this piston was not riding true in the bore. It was cocked a little bit, just a little bit. But that's all it takes. Now, if you look at the rod appears to be dead straight, but there's a little kink someplace, probably right there at the pin, that's having this thing ride just off a little bit. It's a light scuff. It's fairly common on an older engine to find stuff like this, but because we're going to be leaning on this engine, I'm not going to use this piston and rod assembly. But the rest of it does look good. Second one that we found a problem with is this. Now, remember, we're building this engine out of core parts. Now, after we had this one cleaned, I noticed right away that there's a discoloration here. You see the beam of the rod is its normal color, and then you get down here and it's black, okay? And then, if you look If you look in here, you can see that it has a bunch of scuff marks that run this way, right? Now normally you'll find little patchy scuff marks on the inside part of the big end, and that's because as the power stroke starts, the piston is being shoved down and the crank is rotating, so you'll get scuff marks, let's say here, right? And that's normal. But in this case, we have lines that run this way. So these lines, coupled with this black right here, tell me that this rod saw a spun bearing at some point in its life. A lot of the engines we're dealing with here are 40, 50, 60 years old. This engine could have been rebuilt, let's say, when it was like 5 years old. And because it was such a long time ago, it'll give all of the appearances of being an original engine, an untouched engine. But that's not always the case. This thing spun a rod. It was probably rebuilt way back in its life. And it ran like this on a street engine for, I don't know, God only knows how many miles. But for our purposes and the fact that we're going to lean on this thing, no good. So this one gets tossed in the capuch. Talking about big ends of the rods, you always want to be able to see some crosshatch. Now, when these engines, when the rod is manufactured, the big end is cut and then they hone it to size. And there'll be a crosshatch in there, very similar to the crosshatch you'll find on a cylinder wall. Now, you also want to make sure that the journal end is round. Like I said, you'll see scuff marks, but those scuff marks don't mean that the rod is distorted. It only means that the reciprocating assembly saw a load, or the bearing saw a load at that point, and so it was always pushing down into the rod. It'll leave a witness mark, but it doesn't necessarily mean the rod is bent. You want to take a caliper like this one, cheap auto parts store caliper, like $20, $25, and you want to measure it in 3 places. Well, first you want to take your fingernail and make sure you can't catch your fingernail on any of the parting lines, right? If that's good, then torque down the nuts, take a caliper like this, and make 3 measurements. Measure it here, right? Then measure it here, and then measure it here. And all 3 of those measurements should be within, let's say, 0.5 of an inch. Anything more than that, and the rod should probably be resized. And while you got the caliper out, and this is especially if you haven't taken the engine apart yourself, when you take a motor apart yourself, you'll know right away if any of the rod nuts are loose as you're pulling it apart. A loose rod nut indicates a stretched rod bolt. In this case, we didn't disassemble these rods or anything, so we don't know the history of it. So what you do is measure the rod bolts for stretch. Okay, and they should all be within a couple of thousandths of an inch of each other. If it's more than that, throw a fresh iron. Now, if you're building a higher RPM engine, something that's going to see a lot of load, something that has a heavy reciprocating assembly, just go ahead and put new rod bolts in and be done with it. For our purposes, we checked all of these rod bolts. None of them are stretched. It's not going to be a high RPM engine. It's a very lightweight reciprocating assembly, so we're just going to go ahead and send it with the weight, set it with the stock pieces. All right, so we've got the connecting rods looked at. Now let's check out the pistons. Visual inspection of the piston. Obviously, you're looking for scuff marks that would be indicative of a bent rod, but you also want to check for any sort of cracks. You want to look for chips in the skirts. Down here, you want to look especially important is, and if you've got a little chip missing out of a piece of the skirt, don't stress it. A lot of times it'll be okay. Obviously, you got a big giant chunk missing, it's a problem. But if you got a little nip or anything like that, dress it out. Don't worry about it. You especially want to look at the pin area underneath the pin. You want to look for any type of cracks in this area like this. You want to look for any type of cracks up here. If you don't see anything there, like I said, visually it's good to go. Now, a lot of times you'll take a piston out of a motor and the pin won't want to move, or it just flops around. A worn pin boss will give you, not only give you a noise, but you could check it just by holding the connecting rod like this and rocking the piston back and forth like so. right? If there's any play in the pin boss, you'll feel it there. But again, don't even bother wasting your time until you've really cleaned it. So, no play here, we're good to go. A lot of times the pin will be stiff. When the pin is stiff, it's generally because there's a bunch of tarnish built up between the pin and the boss on the piston. When that happens, if it's stiff, what you do is you take a propane or a MAP gas torch like this, and heat the piston like this, right? And hit the other side. And do that to the point where you can take the piston and actually move it on the pin. You take some penetrating fluid, PB Blaster or WD-40, whatever, anything will work. Just make sure it's light so it gets in there. Spray both parts of the pin and work it back and forth. So, and this is what you want to see. If you don't have it that free, then there's a problem. If after you do that a couple of times, you give it heat and penetrating fluid and work it through, it still doesn't want to just flop over like that, time for a new piston. So, what else did I want to go over with this? Oh, yeah. So you've sent these things to the machine shop to be cleaned, and they come back and they're looking all pretty and stuff like that. But their cleaning process will not get inside of the ring lands. This is very important because having clean ring lands, now remember, when the power stroke starts, one of the first reactions of the reciprocating assembly is that pressure will get behind, pressure comes along the sides of the piston, and it will get behind the ring and push the ring out. And that's what gives you the initial seal. That's also why you'll see on your engine when you've taken it apart, you've got that line that runs around the top of the bore. That's where the ring is being expanded because of the pressure pulse. If there's any carbon behind the ring, there may not be enough room for that pressure to get in and act evenly on the ring, so you don't get optimum seal. So what I do is I take out one of the old rings, break it in half, take the broken edge, right? Cover it up, give it a wrap of tape, and that's your handle now. And you take the old square edge, and let me do this over here. You take the old square edge, and you push it through the ring land, and you get all of that carbon out. You see the carbon that's coming out of there? You want to go all the way around and work that all out. There's a lot coming out of there. And you want to do that on the top and the second ring lands. Right? Usually there's not much in the second ring land, but you want to get on anyway. That one was clean. And also while you're doing this is very important. If this piston during the course of its life saw any extended detonation cycles or severe overheating, it's possible that the head of the piston has distorted, and what will happen is it'll push down on the ring lands, it'll pinch down the ring lands. So by taking this ring like this, after everything has been cleaned, and running it through the ring land like this, you can see if there's any tight spots. So if you find any tight spots, piston's no good. Start all over again. Don't bother trying to file it, because once the piston head has been distorted, it'll just keep going. So, you know, and that's, a lot of guys go, yeah, I'll just file out the ring land. Don't do it. It's a waste of time. Pistons are cheap. Get yourself another piston. I think that's it. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover with this. Yeah, so I've got to find one more piston and rod, run it over, have them clean it up for me real good, and then the rest of it is just straight assembly, nothing fancy. And we'll get this thing done. I'm dying to get this car together, running, and out of here so I can get the Miata in and try to get that thing fired up. So, but that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.